Just a few hours before we started recording here, TCU landed a commitment. Travis Jackson from Tyler Legacy. So we'll break it all down with John Garcia, as well as some potential players that the Frogs are after. That's all coming up next on Locked On Horned Frogs.
You are Locked On Horned Frogs, your daily podcast on the TCU Horned Frogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Horned Frogs can subscribe on YouTube. I'm Steven Simcox. In the box next to me is John Garcia Jr., recruiting insider. And last week we talked about Haas Haney, the Frogs' first commit of the 2024 class. And this past week they picked up a couple commits. The most recent being Travis Jackson, defensive end out of Tyler Legacy. And John, I saw that he's had some big offers lately. Recently got an Alabama offer, good size at 6'3", 230. What are your thoughts on him as a prospect, and what have you seen from him as a player in his high school career?
Well, look, there's a lot to like here. I think if you look at it just from an optics perspective, anytime Alabama offers a kid that picks your school, fans of that school should be excited about it, especially to me when it comes in the trenches or at a premium position, like as a pass rusher, which is, of course, what Jackson is listed at 6'4", 230 or so. Get this. He ran the 100-meter dash in track at 6'4", 230 pounds. So, yeah, he's in the 11s. It's not, Usain Bolt. But just to be on the track in the state of Texas, where track is really king, and to compete there, I think says a lot about the effort and the straight line running ability that Travis brings to the table. And you pop on the tape on Friday nights and you see a whole heck of a lot of it, not only from a true athletic perspective. The first step looks good. His motor looks really strong, but it's the activity that really stood out to me. I think he's a little bit raw. I think there's a lot to work on from a technical perspective in terms of being a sophisticated pass rusher, developing counter moves, all the stuff that comes with, going from high school to college football. But you can't teach the frame, the athleticism, and the effort. That activity that he shows is really impressive to me, because there are a lot of situations on tape where his first move doesn't work and he's not that technically sound. So it's not like he's getting out of it with efficiency and great footwork. He's just doing it from pure will in some cases. And he's chasing down ball carriers down the line of scrimmage or even into the backfield. He's wrecking havoc on the quarterback and the left tackle without great polished pass rushing moves. So the athleticism and activity shows up here in a really big way. So when he does fill out a little bit more and he polishes up from a technical standpoint, now all of a sudden, I think you could start to see how great of a take this is for TCU. And then you mentioned it, the Alabama offer coming less than a week before committing to TCU. That's a big deal, because nobody would have blamed Jackson if he slowed the process down, took more visits, and allowed his offer list to grow or to vet Alabama in particular. But he's seen enough from TCU to jump in the boat there. So I think that says a lot about the trajectory of the program. And we can now call it momentum, right? 3 commitments in the month of April, and things are sort of underway in a big way in the state of Texas in particular, which is, of course, always critical for the Horned Frogs. So I really like this get, and this one will probably play better as time goes on, not just because Alabama jumped in, but I just think truly that foundation is one of the best I've seen in Texas this cycle, which means the production and all of that will come with it later rather than sooner.
On the other side of the trenches, they pick up a commitment from Ryan Hughes, the offensive tackle out of the Woodlands. Sort of a funny story. So I heard he'd already visited. He was going to go to the spring game, but he got caught up in like really bad Houston traffic. And so
it happens.
Yeah, it does happen. He just ended up calling the coaching staff being like, well, I'm not going to make it a spring game, but I do want to go ahead and make this official. So he's committed. Another 3-star prospect on the offensive line. What do you like about what you've seen from him or heard about him through this process?
So for Jackson, we talk about the ceiling, the long-term development there. With Hughes, it's the opposite. I love the floor. I love what he already presents. First of all, 6'6", 300 pounds, can't teach that, right? And he already plays left tackle at the Woodlands, as you mentioned, playing against great competition. So if you're already tasked to be the blindside protector, the cornerstone for a school like that, I do think it says a lot about the responsibility and consistency that Hughes brings to the table. Now, at the next level at TCU, maybe he's a right tackle, maybe he's a guard. I think that's all up for debate. But the floor of having that on his resume now, I do think says a lot. And you see that listed size and you say, okay, well, I expect him to be long. It's true. I expect him to be physical. That is true. And it really shows up on tape. There's really not a lot of scenarios where just man-to-man, head-to-head, Hughes isn't winning some of these battles from a physical standpoint. I do think, again, even though I like the floor, there's still room to improve here. I think his pad level can come down a little bit more. He could probably work a little bit more efficiently with that footwork, which makes me think a little bit more right tackle and guard at the next level. But the floor here, I think, is really strong. What you see on tape now, he looks like a collegiate lineman today. So if that is what translates to TCU, it's not the end of the world, even if he doesn't play tackle. So I do like the floor of this get. Always important to go into Houston, of course, from a recruiting standpoint anyway. And I think it shows the conviction recruits have with this class to plan to make an in-person commitment, and you don't get to do that, but you still go ahead and follow through and make that phone call. I think it does say a lot about Ryan Hughes' character. So, yeah, I really like this get for the Horned Frogs from a floor perspective, even though we talk about Jackson and even Haney from more of a ceiling standpoint. You do need variance as you build a recruiting class, and I think Hughes is starting to provide that on the other side of the coin.
John, I've heard before O-line is one of the tougher positions to project. As someone who's been doing this for a long time, what makes it, trickier than, say, a wide receiver or defensive back at the next level?
Because I think with those two positions that you just compared to in particular, there's so much more flexibility and freedom to operate and still be considered successful, right? If you're a receiver, you can be so many different types of great, right? You could be a speed downfield threat. You could be masterful after the catch. You could be a great contested catcher. So even if you don't run a great route, but you have a great catch radius and you're good in contention, you could still be really productive. I think with offensive linemen, it's so much more black and white on the surface level. And then on top of it, the transition is so much more to grasp. There's not a lot of high school offensive linemen that are working through sophisticated offenses where they're having to make checks at the line of scrimmage and deal with multiple blitzers and deal with changing the offensive play maybe simultaneously. And when you make that jump, there's so much more mental components that go onto offensive line play relative to wide receiver and defensive back. Same thing. It's reactionary for the most part, right? You could really build off of that and play to a strength if a cornerback maybe is physically gifted, but mentally he's maybe less further along. You could play to that and say, hey, let's minimize what we're asking of you and say, hey, go man to man or go play in this zone and own that zone. You can't really do that along the offensive line. And then positionally, I think for a guy like Hughes in particular, high school left tackle, I don't see it at the next level. So now you're talking about going to the other side of the line of scrimmage, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but you ask any big man and playing with your right foot up for your whole career and now going to the other side, left foot up, different viewpoints and what you're asking to do, it's a big deal. It's a heck of a transition. So I just think there's a lot of intricacies that are just really hard to forecast with offensive linemen. You can have the great size and the great footwork and all of that, but what do you grasp mentally, schematically when you make that jump? And then positionally, how do you fit relative to the scheme? These offenses want to go so fast right now, so they're condensing the playbook, and it's about going incredibly quickly and going off of these calls. So if you never grasp that end of it, you don't see the field anyway. So there's so much more to me that goes into O-line evaluations compared to other positions. And I think that's why it's a little bit more of a crapshoot, to be honest.
Final thing for you. This is a guy that a lot of people know. Colin Simmons, one of the best players in the country, defensive end, edge guy of Duncanville. I watched the Duncanville North Shore State Championship game, John, and I know North Shore has a ton of talent. They could not block him. Like, he dominated that football game. He's a special player. He visited TCU. Apparently he and his family had a good time. I know everyone is going after him. What are your thoughts and kind of what are you hearing about his decision and where he might end up?
I think TCU is a sneaky dark horse here. Look, there's no doubt that other programs have more optical momentum with Simmons. I think everybody starts with Texas and moves to LSU pretty quickly. And then the group thereafter, you could kind of form on your own just based on the week. He's a well-traveled kid, so everybody has some semblance of hope here. But if you expand and look into it, TCU's closest to home. That's obvious. Family's going to be important in this decision, and they're already sort of signing off on the TCU angle, which I really think is an important factor here. The momentum is building with this class, and we obviously know what just happened on the field at the end of last season on top of it. So the buy-in for a program like TCU isn't as hard to sell this time around. And then if you want to go to the tangible, there's only one school that he's visited on record more than TCU. It's Texas, which is probably the odds-on favorite at this point. But if you start to allow the process to take shape, TCU being the school he's visited second most, just as much as LSU, would probably surprise a lot of people in talking about Colin Simmons, even though we know he's well traveled. So you don't take a bunch of trips like that if you are uninterested, if you are truly not considering a certain program. So I do think that's another feather in TCU's cap. And then look, maybe the biggest feather in their cap is that there's no indication this thing is ending anytime soon. So if you are theoretically playing from behind like TCU might be in this recruitment, the fact that Colin has really not committed to a true timeline, whether it's preseason, during the season, after the season, whatever it is, the longer we don't know, the more likely it is, I should say, that it's going to push towards the end of the season and the fall. So if you need to make up ground, you have more time to do so. It sounds simple, but that matters in recruiting a whole heck of a lot. So I think all of those things are important for TCU in this approach, even though, again, perceptionally, TCU's in that group of schools behind LSU and Texas that are really trying to make up ground. But Colin is going to do as much due diligence as any elite recruit in the country. And he's only set a couple of officials. So I wouldn't even rule out a TCU official visit at this point, especially now that it's unlimited for recruits. So you want to get to a big game, get him back in Fort Worth. Now you can fund the trip, at least from he's close to home, but at least from a meals and experience standpoint, you can enhance it just a little bit from TCU's perspective. So all of those things, I think, point the arrow up for TCU with Colin Simmons, as long as none of those change in an abrupt fashion, which, again, we don't get the sense that's happening with Colin, even though so many schools are after his services.
I'm always amazed. John Garcia Jr., we talk about draft guys. There's so many prospects. There's like a bajillion high school players. That's an official number. So I'm just like, John, tackle from the Woodlands, and he's able to rattle off some really good stuff. But you should follow him on Twitter at John Garcia_Jr. If you like talking ball, that's where you go. John, thanks for being on the show with us today.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
This is Locked On Horned Frogs. It's your team every day.